All right, good evening. If you'd like to open to Exodus chapter 18, we will be in Exodus chapter 18 tonight. And considering the advice of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. And so over the past couple of months, we've followed Moses through a lot of things. We saw his birth, and then his time in Midian, and then the conflict that we had with Pharaoh, which culminated in the Red Sea and the Red Sea crossing, and the song that they sang in chapter 15. In chapter 16, we picked up kind of on a new section of Exodus that focuses on what God alone can do, and really emphasizing the fact that He alone is God, and the evidence of that. In chapter 16 and 17, where they had the manna and then the water from the rock and their victory over the Amalekites, emphasizing how God alone can really satisfy all of the basic needs of life that we have, and how the New Testament really points to that being a spiritual satisfaction primarily. But in chapter 18, it transitions to kind of focus on how God alone is the one that can deliver us from life's issues. And so he starts in chapter 18 and verse 1 and says, "And Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel his people, that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back, with her 2 sons, of whom the name of one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land, and the name of the other was Eleazar, for he said, the God of my father was my help, and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. Now he said to Moses, I, your father-in-law, Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her." And so you have 6 verses here that really, within themselves, there's quite a bit of repetition, isn't it? Repetition of names and repetition of Jethro coming to Moses and bringing his wife and his sons. And when you hear names like Jethro and Midian and Zipporah and Gershom, what do those names automatically make us think of as far as the context of Exodus goes? What do those names bring to mind first? Not a lot, apparently. I'm sorry, what's that?
I said Moses' family.
Yeah, it takes you back to the first part of Exodus, doesn't it? It takes you back to his time, starting in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 11, all the way to the end of chapter 4. It takes you back to the time that Moses was in Midian with these people. Chapter 4 describes the birth of his children, and that's repeated here for us. And so it's just taking us back to a prior time that we've already read about, and through that is going to remind us of some things. And you think Moses here is re-recording his own history. He's remembering his own history and the 40 years that he spent away from Egypt and away from the Israelites and away from Pharaoh. The 40 years that he spent as a shepherd with his father-in-law. And so taking us back to that time kind of points to something in particular. And I think perhaps it comes out most obvious when you look at verse 3, because in verse 3, he says that she came back with her 2 sons, of whom the name of one was Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. And so by reminding us here of what Moses had named his first son, what is Moses himself sort of remembering about this time period? He's been in a foreign land before, hasn't he? Now they've left Egypt and they've crossed the Red Sea and they're not wandering yet, but they're en route to Mount Sinai. And so they're foreigners in a land that they do not call home. And Moses is remembering, really, I've already done this. I spent 40 years in a land that I wasn't raised in, that my family that I was born to didn't grow up in. And what is it that got Moses through that time as a stranger in a foreign land? Well, it's God that delivered him. And then look also then at verse 4, where it says the name of the other was Eliezer, for he said, "The God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh." And so you have Moses reviewing his history here, and he says, first, I was already a stranger in another land. But then he goes back and he kind of reviews his first 40 years in kind of a nutshell and says, remember, he was born and he was raised in Egypt. Remember how that ended. He tried to kind of take leadership of the Israelites. He sort of removed himself from Pharaoh, and so he killed one of the Egyptian guards. And then when it was found out, and the Israelites were like, "Who do you think that you are to lead us?" He ran away from the Pharaoh who wanted to kill him. And that happens in Exodus chapter 2. And so he kind of reviews his first 40 years of life there. But again, what is it that gets him through the first 40 years of life? He says, God was my help. It was God who delivered me. And so in just a few words, Moses has reviewed his 80 years of life and said through every step of the way, whether I was at home or in a foreign land, whether I was liked by my family or rejected by the people I was born to, it doesn't matter where I was or what was happening, it was always God that delivered me. And that's really, I think, going to be the key thought throughout this whole chapter. And so he then picks up in verse 5, and he says, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness, where he was encamped at the mountain of God. Now, thinking back to earlier in the book of Exodus, what is the significance about camping at what he calls the mountain of God? Why is that important? And you've got to look back at Exodus chapter 3 and verse 12 to remember what's important about this. In Exodus chapter 3 and verse 12, and this is when Moses was out tending to his sheep, and he sees the bush that's on fire but not consumed by the fire, and God is talking to him about what he wants him to do. And first, starting in verse 1, we'll just look at one thing in verse 1. If you notice at the very end of verse 1, it says that Moses came to Horeb, which is called the mountain of God. And so that's where Moses is when he sees the burning bush and hears the statement, I am. He's on Horeb, the mountain of God. But notice in verse 12, there's a promise that God makes. So he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. And so back to verse 1, that's the mountain of God. That's Horeb. And so in chapter 18 and verse 5, as we kind of go back in Moses' memory, and he's thinking to that day that he saw the burning bush, it says that there they are encamped at the mountain of God, at Mount Horeb. God had promised, and it was fulfilled. And so he thinks about his first 80 years of life and says every step of the way. You think even before Moses has memory, as he records in Exodus chapter 1 when he was born, and there's Pharaoh's command to kill all the baby boys, but he's put into a basket in the Nile River where the crocodiles and hippos like to eat babies, and he's floated down and saved by Pharaoh's daughter herself, and that God every step of the way has always taken care of Moses. And to top that off, now they're here as a nation, right where God said they would be, just sometime earlier when he told Moses to go in the first place. And so he's started on this mountain, he's left the mountain, he's come back to the mountain, and it's all been fulfilled just exactly how God promised. And it's just further confirmation. God always delivers, and God alone delivers. And so he ends in verse 6, and he said to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and her 2 sons with her. Now that's probably honestly what a messenger said. It was really common. If you think back to Genesis, remember when Jacob and Esau finally saw each other after all their time apart? And as they got closer and closer, remember Jacob kind of split his kids and his wives up into different groups, and he was sending, remember he sent messengers ahead with gifts this is something they did a lot. The man of the family would send a messenger ahead to say, "I'm coming." And so that's probably this is why Jethro is talking about himself in the first person. It's probably something a messenger said. The messenger says, "I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you with your wife and your 2 sons with her." And so just as God always delivers, God has also delivered his family back to him, and they're reunited. And so there's sort of this sense of completion. The story has kind of come to a satisfying end, at least as far as getting back to the mountain with his whole family intact, and not just his physical family, but the entire nation of his family. They're all there together, just as God promised that they would be. Any thoughts on these first 6 verses before we move on to verses 7 through 12?
Looking at the references, and I do not remember that there being that many times that he referenced the mountain of God.
Oh, yes. It's mentioned quite often. Yes, ma'am. And
sometimes with the name of the mountain, and
other times not, sort of expected that you will pick up on that fact and remember what that mountain is on your own. Yes, Johnny.
Verse 1 talks about Jethro himself, a priest of Midian.
Yes.
A priest of what?
A priest of what? We're actually going to look at that in the next section. So let's hold off for just a moment. It'll come up in just a moment. But that is a really good question. A priest of what? And so he makes a statement in just a little bit that.
We go all the way back to Melchizedek.
Yes.
Earlier in this whole journey, it says Melchizedek was a priest, but a priest of what?
A priest of God Most High is all it says. Yeah. Yeah, and I do think you do have these images of, especially if you take what Hebrews 7 says about Melchizedek, you have these sort of pockets of people who did worship God, even though they were not the chosen nation of God the way that Israel was. But you did find people who knew God and worshiped God outside of the chosen nation of Israel. And of course, Genesis is before there is a nation of Israel. But yeah, and so I think that's potential here. But we'll look at that more in a minute. Anything else on this section here? If not, we'll pick up in verse 7. And so God alone is who delivered Moses in a strange land. So the people are now in a strange land, but they can draw on Moses' experience to see, well, he can keep delivering us. Verses 7 through 12 kind of emphasizes the history that they just lived at together, that it was God alone who delivered them from Egypt. Notice what it says in verse 7. So Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and he bowed down as a sign of respect, and he kissed him, and so that's just like a greeting on the cheek kind of thing. And they asked each other about their well-being. I like that. Even back then, they said, "How are you doing?" "Oh, I'm doing fine." But, it was they had the same kind of thing going on there. And they went into the tent. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And then Jethro rejoiced. Jethro rejoiced for all the good which the Lord had done for Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them." And then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and other sacrifices to offer to God. And Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. And so, as we consider these verses 7 through 12, what phrase is most obviously repeated in this section over and over again? It's the Lord. The Lord delivered them, right? Over and over again. And so when you see a key phrase like that, that's really kind of gives you an idea of what the section or the chapter or whatnot is about. And that's part of the reason why I say that's really the theme of the whole chapter, because you just see it in the first section and this section over and over again. This is about what God alone can do. Only He can save us, can deliver us. And so you have in verses 7 through 8 them reviewing what happened in Egypt, that God had brought them out of Egypt. And then again in verse 9 you have Jethro is, we know that he knew this to a degree, because back in verse 1 it said that he had heard of all that God had done for Moses and Israel's people, that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. But here he's really getting the first-hand account of it directly from Moses. And so his response is, this is really good news. He rejoices to hear about it, again emphasizing whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians, what the Lord had done for Israel. And so the emphasis there is, God did it. Nobody else did it. It was God. Now certainly people had parts to play. Moses had his part to play along with Aaron to go and to talk to Pharaoh. Moses and Aaron had their parts to play when they would perform the miracles with a staff. The people had their part to play in keeping the Passover and in being ready to leave the land. They had to do their part, and if they didn't, they would have been left there and suffered the plagues just like the Egyptians did. But even in they do their part, if God didn't do his part, their part would be nothing, and it wouldn't have helped them at all. God is the one, he says, who brought them out of Egypt. And then verses 10 through 11, he blesses God. It's literally the idea of to speak well of God. And he says again, he delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, out of the hand of Pharaoh. Again, he delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. And so you think, well, why is he saying it over and over again? It's like when your teacher says, it's going to be on the test if I say it 3 times. This is the key emphasis here. Only God can do this. But I think verse 11 is really the most important. In fact, I drew a giant exclamation point in my Bible and colored it in right next to verse 11 because I think this is the key. Really, this is what the book of Exodus is about as a whole. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. This is one of the main things that God wanted to accomplish with what he did in Egypt. Now I can see it. Maybe I had doubts before. Maybe I'd never even heard of God before. But now, after looking at all the evidence and seeing what God can accomplish, I know that there is no God like he is, which is really the key idea throughout. God alone. In other words, nobody is like him. He is unique, and he's higher, and he's greater. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. For in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, and you think, behave there, it's almost like saying they acted presumptuously. They claimed to be good at something, but in the very thing that they claimed to be good at, he was above them. He was greater than them. I'm sorry. This is what Jethro is saying. Right. Yes. Yeah, Jethro is coming to this reality. Right. Jethro is understanding this more fully maybe than he did before. And so now what does he mean really when he says that God was above them in the things that they behaved proudly in, the other gods? What does Jethro mean by that? When you think back to what the other Sarah?
He was referring mainly to the Egyptian people that they trusted in stone and wood.
Sure.
And those gods, so they thought, were powerful. But God said, no, wait a minute, I'm in charge. I'm in power.
Right. And so when you think the 10 plagues were really,
slap in the face.
a slap in the, yeah, there was a God over each of those 10 things the Egyptians believed. That was the ultimate God over whatever that was. You think the plague of darkness, they had a God who they believed was over the sun and that nobody could conquer him. And so for the Israelites, God to be able to bring darkness is to say he is greater than the God over the sun. But 10 times, he did that. And so the thing that they're supposed to be good at, God is better at it than they are. Now, you notice in verse 11, does he say specifically that those gods are not real gods? He doesn't say that outright, does he? And that's, you notice through the first couple of books of the Bible, the first few books of the Bible, the people really struggle with the idea that there is only one God. And while God is going to emphasize that, especially when you get to Deuteronomy, by the time we get to Deuteronomy, God wants them to know that. He is very patient with them as they go through this, and in trying to show them not just that he is higher than the other gods, but that he is the only God. But it doesn't seem like perhaps Jethro has even fully figured that out yet. And so back to kind of Johnny's question earlier, a priest of what? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us specifically what Jethro was a priest of, at least not up to this point. Did Jethro believe in more than one God? Probably. That seems to be the indication of verse 11. Was he a priest of the God before Exodus 18? I don't know. The Bible doesn't specifically say that. But I imagine that after this point, he's a priest of the God. So does that kind of answer your question, Johnny?
Other places, time goes on, that the children of Israel are one of God's chosen people, and take on priests of other gods or other religions.
Sure.
They're still called priests.
Yes.
That kind of confuses you. I never thought Jethro could be the priest of the God, the only God.
Right.
But
Well, and you have to think up to this point. Remember, in Exodus 18, God has not delivered the Ten Commandments to the Israel. Technically, in Exodus 18, they are only a nation of Israel in a promised sense, as far as being God's special. He won't even really make that formal until chapter 19, and from Abraham to Moses, they're just like all the other nations. They are we call it patriarchal, that God communicates with the head of the family, who then communicates with the rest of the family. And so that's how you can have, God's covenant with Israel, which hasn't even taken place yet, was only with Israel, but he still had covenant, or was at least open to having covenants with other nations. And so that's how you can have God having one covenant with Abraham, and clearly another covenant with Melchizedek. And then here you have God's covenant with the nation of Israel that's fixing to happen. But that doesn't mean that every other nation was just forgotten about. He still was open to having covenants with them, although it would be very different from what he has with the nation of Israel, which is what makes them special.
the Bible makes reference to seeing something Solomon said in Second Chronicles, all the way up 2 Chronicles 5.
Okay.
Right before he was supposed to build the temple,
Yes.
it says that the temple which I will build will be great, for our God is greater than all the gods.
Yes.
Solomon makes reference to the other, what happened to Solomon later in life.
Right.
He turned to question all these other gods too.
Yes. It would be a long time before Israel really solidified that idea that there was only one God. They struggled with that for generations. I think by the time of Jesus they do, and that's part of what the book of Nehemiah is about. But yeah, through the whole Old Testament, they struggle with that, even up to the point of Nehemiah. And so, so that's a good point. And if you, from verse 11, if you go back to chapter 16 and verse 12, chapter 16 and verse 12, Moses is talking to the people. Moses is, the Lord is speaking through Moses to the people at the time that he's given them the manna. And he says in verse 12, I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. And so this is really a constant theme throughout. God is just continually proving himself. Really, when you think about the book of Exodus, the people are not on trial in the book of Exodus. God is on trial in essence. Not that God has done anything wrong, but just that they don't know him yet. And so he is continually trying to convince them through the miracles and the plagues and the provisions that he gives them, that he is the God worth paying attention to. In fact, if you go back to Exodus chapter 2 and verse 24, Exodus chapter 2 and verse 24, or verse 23, I guess, Exodus 2:23, it says there, now it happened in the process of time that the king of Egypt died, and then the children of Israel groaned because of their bondage, and they cried out, and their cry came up to God because of their bondage, and so God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant. Notice it says they groaned, and God heard it, but nowhere does it specifically say that they groaned to God. They are asking for help, but it doesn't necessarily say they were asking to help from the God of Abraham. God just heard it and took action to do something about it. And so even in slavery, I think sometimes we've taught it that way, that they prayed to God and God came and delivered them. By this point, they may have even really sort of begun to forget what was promised to Abraham. And so they're, in a way, almost being completely introduced to God for the first time here in the book of Exodus. He's still trying to prove that to them, partially because they're stubborn and partially just because there's a lot of ground to cover there. And so Jethro is sort of an example of someone like that. maybe he wasn't sure before, or maybe he always was a priest of the God and he just grew in his faith that day. But either way, he says, now I see it more clearly. Now I know. And that's why in verse 12, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and other sacrifices to offer to God, and then shared a meal with Aaron and the elders of Israel along with Moses before God. And so that was sort of a worship thing and a sacrifice thing that they did. And so you get that God alone is great, and he alone is worth sacrificing to. Of all the gods that Jethro could have sacrificed to that day, he only sacrificed to God, because God alone can deliver people out of their captivity or out of their problems. So, all right, that was kind of a lot of information. What thoughts do we have about verses 7 through 12? Okay. Picking up then in verse 13, it says, and so it was, on the next day, that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. So, when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did for the people, he said, what is this thing that you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit? And he said, why do you alone sit, and all the people stand before you from morning until evening? And I think here the story transitions just a little bit, but we're still dealing with Jethro, and we're still dealing with Moses. And so I think it's important not to forget the review that's been given to us in the first 12 verses. In the first 6 verses, we reviewed the first 80 years of Moses' life, with the overarching point being, God was always the one who delivered me from my troubles. In the next few verses to verse 12, we review Egypt, but again, the overwhelming point is, God is the only one who delivers us. And so, keeping that review in mind, when we get into verses 13 and 14, and it talks about Moses doing this job alone, what is the significance of him doing the job alone with the review of his lifetime in mind and God being the one who delivers him out of things?
Well, because he speaks to God.
Okay, and so he does have kind of a specialized role, and I think that's true. He has a specialized role, but as we continue, what follows is Jethro says, "This isn't good. Right? You're taking on too much on yourself." And I really think that's kind of the key thought there is Moses is beginning to come to a place, or at least is in danger of coming to a place of feeling, I have to be the one to do this. I have to be the one to sit before all the people and receive judgment, or to give judgment on all of their matters. Because I have this specialized role, I have to be the one to fill this role, no matter how much time it takes me every day, no matter how strenuous the task becomes. And I think that really is, if you kind of fast forward to application, a danger that a lot of people fall into sometimes is, you have a job in the church, or you have a role that you play, and sometimes the danger could become, well, nobody can do what I do. I have to be the one to do this job or that job. Nobody could do it as well as I do, or nobody has the time to do it, or nobody, that I'm the only one. But when you say I'm the only one, what have we forgotten from verses 1 through 12? It's not I alone, it's God alone delivers. Kenny, were you going to say something?
I was just thinking that what types of things he must have been
Oh, yeah.
judging about. I like what my Bible says, that he had to render decisions all
Yes.
day long.
If you want to know the kind of things that he was.
I know they were inquiring some about God.
Yes.
Learn more about him, but I just wonder what.
Oh, I think it's, if y'all ever seen those shows on TV like Judge Judy or something, people bring their, I think it would have been a lot like that kind of stuff. But really, no, if you really want to know the kinds of things, I think there is a book by, are you familiar with Glenn Colley? He's a member of the church, and he writes a lot of books that are good. But he wrote a book called Awake at Night. And basically it was, I think, 100 case studies of people had emailed him questions, elderships had emailed him questions of, here's this bizarre thing that my church is dealing with. What's your advice for us to do with this? And so he then sent back, and then he puts it in a book, the 100 questions, bizarre accounts of things that churches deal with, and then what his advice is. read that book, and I think you'll have some sense of the bizarre kinds of things that Moses would have had to deal with, and some sense of what elders have to deal with. It's not always as easy as it looks. But at any rate, I think, yeah, that's a good point, Kenny. A little, it is. It's a little, that's why it's called Awake at Night. It's a little scary. But at any rate, yeah. I'm not saying that Moses felt that way that day, but just if we ever find ourselves saying the statement, "Well, I have to be the one to do this. I'm irreplaceable. If I wasn't here to do this, it wouldn't get done." We have begun to trust in me, and we have forgotten God alone delivers. And so he continues then in verse 15, and Moses said to his father-in-law, he's answering his question, "What are you doing?" "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one and another, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws." And so, really, it's a very straightforward answer. It doesn't give us any indication that Moses was in a wrong mindset yet. But you could see how it could develop that. I'm the one who does this. I'm the one that God chose to stand before the people, how it could get to that place. But he continues in verse 17, and Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, said to him, "The thing that you do is not good." Now, has anyone ever, something that is your area of expertise, right? Your field, the thing that you're really good at, and then someone comes to you and they say, "The way that you're doing this is not good." That can just crawl all over a person, especially some of us. It can just really crawl all over a person. "Excuse me? I've been doing this for how many? I think I know what I'm doing." And of course, Jethro doesn't mean that everything Moses is doing is bad. He's saying it's all good, except it's too much. There's one thing that's not good. The thing that you're doing is not good. Verse 18, "Both you and these people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out, for this thing is too much for you." He says even the people are going to get worn out. They're going to get tired of standing in line all day. They're going to get tired of waiting to have their judgments, and it's going to cause problems. For this thing is too much for you, and you are not able to perform it by yourself. Listen now to my voice. Right? That's another one of those key things that people say sometimes. Well, listen. Right? When someone says just listen, doesn't that kind of crawl all over you sometimes? Listen. But Jethro is a very wise man. He says, "Listen now to my voice. I will give you counsel," and this is key, "and God will be with you." Now go back to chapter 17 and remember the question that they asked in verse 7. After Moses struck the rock and gave them water out, and God gave them water out of the rock, so he called, chapter 17, verse 7, "So he called the name of the place Massa and Meribah," which is to complain or to contend, "because of the contention of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, 'Is the Lord among us, or is he not?'" That's the prevailing question, really, for most of the book, but especially for this section of the book. Is the Lord here, or is he not here? And then remember, the very next section of chapter 17 was the Amalekites, the battle. And when Moses held his staff up, they had victory. But if he began to lower his staff, they did not. Because when they could see the staff, they believed that he was among them, and they had victory. But when he lowered the staff, they began to doubt God, and they began to lose. And so, of course, they had to hold his hands up so that he could keep the staff up so that they could win the battle. But that's is the Lord among us? Well, yes. And when we believe that, we have the power to prevail. But it's going to ask this question over and over. And so here to Moses, chapter 18 and verse 9, he says, "Listen to my voice. I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. Stand before God for the people, so that you may bring the difficulties to God." Now, before we go on, notice here, what is being described of Moses, or Moses' response to this, is what's called meekness. And that's, if you remember Numbers chapter 13, or Numbers chapter 12, Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3, when his siblings, Aaron and Miriam, complain about his new wife. And it says, now, in parentheses, it says in verse 3, "Now Moses was the meekest man on the earth." And meekness, when you think meekness, you can think kind of the idea of a team player, that he knows his place on the team, and he's not trying to take somebody else's spot. He's content with his place on the team, and not trying to steal from somebody else. And so that's Moses has a pretty, he's like the quarterback kind of. He has a pretty important place on the team. But that doesn't mean that he should not be open to counsel. Meekness is open to accept counsel, even if somebody is counseling you about the thing that you're really good at. And that's hard for a lot of people to do. But if we have the mindset that it's not me who can save these people or can do this job, but God alone, through me or through whoever he chooses can do it, then we're open to that counsel, because we're not doing it for my ego or because I've always done this or because I'm good at it. We're doing it for God. And so in verse 20, he says, you shall teach them the statutes, you'll teach them the laws, you'll show them the way in which they must walk and the work that they must do. But moreover, you shall select from all the people able men. Now, they're not just anybody. They have to fear God. They have to be men who are known to not tell lies. And they have to hate covetousness. Why would they have to hate covetousness? All right, they're not going to accept bribes, right? They're above bribery, so that they'll judge righteously, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And verse 22, let them judge the people at all times. And then it will be that every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they will deal with. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this thing, and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all the people will also go to their place in peace. And so he says, accept my counsel, and Moses is very meek. He's a team player, so he's willing to listen. And the counsel is to train trustworthy workers. And so you think that's people who can help you? Another way to put that is people who can replace you. That's hard sometimes to accept, someone who could take my place. But he does that because he trusts God and not himself. He trusts God alone. And so, I'm sorry, go ahead.
In the matters of medical type decisions, I'm sure he was the only one that was capable of doing that. But I'm wondering if he was able to pass that down too to the people he selected to train.
Well, I think, that's that's what the training of verse 20 is about. And that's, you think, even in the New Testament, we have the same command. That's 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 2, when Paul tells Timothy to train, trustworthy men. Yes, to pass on the gospel, to keep the work going. And then verse 23 is really the idea, and he says, and God so commands you. If you do this thing, and if God commands it, so it says, go check with God first, right? I'm not in charge here, God is, which is that same mindset of meekness. If God commands you, then you'll be doing this for God, and that's because you trust God. Now, remember that the whole point of this chapter is God delivers you, and God is the only one. And so, how has God delivered Moses through Jethro in this instance?
Oh, he's freed up his time.
Yes, yeah. Wisdom, yes.
He was helping him see that he needed help, because it would break him in the end.
Right, Moses was not in danger of Pharaoh or war at this point, but he's in danger of, burnout or of, just overdoing it or whatever it is, yeah. And so God delivers him through his father-in-law and through helpers, through people to do it with him. And that you think, God is not just the God who can save us from danger. He's not just the God who can save us from, battles or what have you, from starvation or dying of thirst. He's the God who can even save us from these kinds of situations. He has a solution and a plan for those things if we will trust him to deliver. And I say that because sometimes I hear people talk about, what do I do about the situation? And they'll say, well, the Bible doesn't really have anything to say about this. It's just unequivocally not true. The Bible has something to say about even the smallest and tiniest detail of your everyday life. Now, maybe not directly. It's not going to say, should I pick pickles to go on my hamburger or not? But the principles are all there if we will dig and look and trust them. Trust that God has the answers, even for situations that are not as obvious as a battle or starvation.
On the other side of the coin too is apparently there's just so many people. I don't know how many there was.
Yeah, a lot of
So
people.
many people that not all of them would have been ever served as far as if they had disputes and things. they needed 7.
Yeah, that Moses couldn't get through it all, and so little problems that aren't dealt with just grow into big problems. And there's, I think, many ways that Jethro is absolutely right in saying this is going to be too much for you, and it's going to wear the people out too. And so he finishes then. I'm sorry, was yes.
If you wanted to scale it or whatever, it'd be like I think Tyler's they try to pass a referendum to get a new courthouse.
Okay.
Because they only have 5 courtrooms and they need 9.
Right.
And that's 100,000 people.
You
We're
think
talking about 2 million here.
how long would it take them to catch up if they could get there? Yeah.
Yeah, but that's 100,000.
Yes. This is
2
probably
million.
bigger. Yeah, it's hard to say for certain, but probably a couple million people potentially anyway, who all have problems at least once and probably multiple times over. So
Well, I'll
yes,
say
sir.
this, Jethro had to be right, because God went along with it, didn't he?
That's right. Yeah, you do.
And he's making people that probably are good people,
Mm-hmm.
he's making them, feel good about themselves
Sure.
and making stronger.
The whole nation gets stronger
That's right.
because it's not just Moses.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. That's what they say. A good leader, if something happened to your leader and he or she left or died or something,
Mm-hmm.
it's a good leader because everything didn't just fall apart or go back how it used to be. There's people who are trained to do the things that were being done.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the principle. Everyone's going to be strengthened by this. So verse 24, Moses heeded the voice of his father-in-law. That's, I think, the evidence that God approved of this, because it's implied that Moses went back and asked God and did all that he said. And Moses chose able men out of all Israel and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s and 10s. And they judged the people at all times. And the hard cases they brought to Moses, but they judged every small case themselves. And so Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way to his own land. And very briefly, I think the last thing that we see here is going back to the idea of meekness, of kind of knowing your place and not trying to take somebody else's place. Meekness lets each person play their part and doesn't try to do their part for them, right? Meekness is not micromanaging, and Moses is choosing not to micromanage all of these people. He accepts his father-in-law's counsel, although he had to put his pride aside to be able to do that. Verse 25, he lets the people do their part. In verse 26, he does do his own part, though, and so it's not letting people do your job, just not doing their job also. And then verse 27, he's let his father-in-law do his part and then go his way, because that's what his part is to do. And so everyone does what they're supposed to do in this ideal situation because of meekness. All right, any last thoughts or comments on this chapter? If not, next week we will pick up and we will cover chapters 19 and 20. And then the last Wednesday of December, we're actually going to be moving out of the book of Exodus and into the book of Joshua. And if you'd like to kind of see where we go from there and stuff, you can pick up one of those schedules that's usually in the foyer. If we're out of them, let me know. But that's next week will be in Exodus 19 and 20, and then we'll move from there into Joshua chapter 1. So thank you for your attention and your comments this evening.